The morning air in Vienna felt different. Maybe it was the history soaked into every cobblestone, or perhaps it was just nerves. For a 19-year-old kid from a small California town, standing outside the Royal Conservatory of Music felt like standing at the gates of heaven itself. His name was David Park, and he was terrified. The building looked like something out of a movie. Tall windows that seemed to stretch forever. Golden details carved into cream-colored stone, and doors so massive they could probably survive an earthquake. David had seen pictures online, of course, but nothing prepared him for the real thing. He clutched a wrinkled grocery bag containing his sheet music and wondered, not for the first time, if this was all a terrible mistake. Inside that building sat people who had trained at places like Juilliard and the Moscow Conservatory. They had performed at Carnegie Hall and the Sydney Opera House. And here he was, a kid whose biggest performance had been at the county fair 3 summers ago, where his piano had competed with the sound of screaming children on the tilt-a-whirl. David checked his watch. 15 minutes until his audition time. His hands were already sweating. He had been in Vienna for 3 days, sleeping on benches at the airport because hotels cost more money than he could imagine spending. His return flight was scheduled for tonight. Win or lose, this was it, one shot. That's all anyone really gets in life, he figured. The conservatory doors suddenly swung open and a girl about his age walked out. She was carrying a violin case that probably cost more than his mom's car. She looked composed, confident, like she belonged here. David pressed himself against the stone wall as she passed, suddenly very aware of his bargain store sneakers and the small coffee stain on his shirt that he'd tried to hide under his jacket. Next audition, piano, a voice called from inside. David Park. This was it. David's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he walked through those enormous doors. The entrance hall took his breath away. Marble floors so shiny he could see his reflection, a ceiling painted with angels and clouds, and a chandelier that looked like it held 1,000 crystals. Each step echoed like a drum announcing his arrival. A stern-looking woman with glasses pointed down a hallway. Third door on the left. Don't be late. He wasn't late, but he definitely felt out of place. The hallway was lined with portraits of composers. Bach stared down at him with judging eyes. Beethoven looked unimpressed. Even Mozart seemed to be saying, "What makes you think you belong here?" David reached the third door and paused. He could hear voices inside, speaking in German and laughing about something. His hand hovered over the doorknob. Everything in him wanted to turn around and run. He could catch an earlier flight. Forget this ever happened. Go home and tell everyone the conservatory wasn't accepting new students this year, but then he thought of Mrs. Eleanor. She wouldn't want him to run. He knocked twice and pushed the door open. The audition room was smaller than he expected, but somehow more intimidating. 3 people sat behind a long wooden table, all watching him enter. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark professional clothing. Papers and folders covered the table in front of them, but it was the piano that really caught his attention. A Steinway grand, black and gleaming like a giant jewel, the kind of instrument he'd only ever seen in videos. The church piano where he usually practiced had 3 broken keys and made a funny rattling sound whenever he hit middle C. "Name," said the man in the center. He didn't look up from his papers. His silver hair was slicked back perfectly, and his suit probably cost more than David's entire trip to Europe. "David Park, sir. From..." The man squinted at a document. "California. Self-taught, it says here." He finally looked up, and his expression said everything. This was going to be a waste of his time. "Who was your primary instructor?" I learned mostly from online videos, sir. And a woman from my town, Mrs. Eleanor Wright. She used to play organ at the Lutheran church." The other male judge, younger with thin-rimmed glasses, actually laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but not kind either. "Internet tutorials and a church organist." "Klaus, perhaps we should move this along. We have 17 more auditions today." Klaus, that was the silver-haired man's name. He was clearly in charge here. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his chest like a king on a throne. "You understand," Klaus said slowly, each word deliberate, "that this conservatory has produced some of the finest musicians in Europe for over 200 years. Our students train under masters. They begin formal instruction at age 4, sometimes younger. They spend a decade preparing just for the entrance examination." "I understand, sir. And yet you thought you could walk in here with..." Klaus gestured at the grocery bag in David's hands. "Your supermarket sheet music and self-taught skills and somehow measure up to that standard?" The woman judge looked uncomfortable. She started to say something but stopped when Klaus held up a hand. David's face burned hot. He should leave. This was humiliating. But something inside him, something that sounded a lot like Mrs. Eleanor's voice, told him to stand his ground. "I came here to play, sir. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to play." Klaus exchanged glances with his colleagues. The younger man shrugged as if to say, "Why not let him fail quickly so we can move on?" The woman looked at David with something that might have been pity. "Very well," Klaus said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. He turned to the younger judge. "Thomas, time this. I give him 30 seconds before the mistakes become unbearable." Then, loud enough for David to hear clearly, he added, "Let him try. He'll fail in seconds." The words hit David like a punch to the stomach, but he'd come too far to quit now. 3 days sleeping on airport benches. A year of saving every dollar from his part-time job at the grocery store. 7 years of practice on a broken piano that his mom bought at a garage sale for $50. And before all that, a promise to a dying woman who believed in him when nobody else did. David walked to the piano, his grocery bag rustling loudly in the silent room. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to fail. Klaus had already picked up his pen, probably ready to write "rejected" before David even played a note. The piano bench was cold through his jeans as he sat down. He adjusted the height, his hands shaking slightly. The keys were smooth under his fingertips, responsive in a way his church piano never was. This instrument was worth more than everything he owned combined. Behind him, he heard Klaus sigh impatiently and mutter something in German to Thomas. David took a deep breath. He thought about Mrs. Eleanor, about the countless afternoons in her small living room, where she'd taught him that music wasn't about perfect technique. It was about feeling. It was about truth. He positioned his hands over the keys and closed, his eyes for just a moment. Then he began to play and everything changed. The first note hung in the air, like a question waiting to be answered. David's fingers found their place on the keys, and suddenly the room didn't feel so big anymore. The judges, the fancy chandelier, the portraits of dead composers in the hallway, all of it faded away. There was only the piano and the music that had been living inside his head for months. He had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. People who knew classical music called it one of the hardest pieces ever written. Mrs. Eleanor had laughed when he first told her he wanted to learn it. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of laugh that says, "Oh, honey, you have no idea what you're getting into." She was right. It had taken him 8 months of daily practice just to get through it without major mistakes. His fingers had cramped. His back had ached. There were nights he wanted to throw his sheet music across the room and give up, but he hadn't given up. And now, sitting in front of the finest piano he'd ever touched, those 8 months of struggle suddenly made sense. The opening measures rolled out of the Steinway like thunder. Deep, powerful bass notes that seemed to come from somewhere in the earth itself. David's left hand moved with a confidence that surprised even him. The church piano back home had weak bass keys that barely made a sound. This instrument responded to every touch, every emotion he poured into it. Behind him, he heard something. A small sound. Maybe a chair shifting. Maybe someone clearing their throat. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The music was already carrying him forward. Klaus sat perfectly still, his pen frozen halfway to the paper. He had been ready to write "inadequate technique" in the comments section. He had been prepared to stop this audition after 30 seconds and move on to someone who actually belonged here. But something was wrong with his plan. Or rather, something was unexpectedly right with what he was hearing. The young man at the piano wasn't playing like a self-taught amateur. He wasn't even playing like most of the conservatory students Klaus had heard over the years. There was something different in the way his hands moved across the keys. Something raw and honest that made Klaus lean forward despite himself. Thomas, the younger judge, had stopped timing. His phone sat forgotten on the table, the stopwatch app still running. He was staring at David's back with an expression somewhere between confusion and amazement. The woman judge, Professor Steinberg, clasped her hands together. She had been teaching at the conservatory for 23 years. She had heard thousands of auditions, most of them blended together in her memory like a single long performance. But every few years, maybe once or twice if she was lucky, she heard something that reminded her why she loved music in the first place. This was one of those times. David's fingers flew across the keys, moving into the faster sections of the piece. His right hand danced over the high notes while his left kept the rhythm steady below. The technical difficulty was obvious. This wasn't music for beginners or even for most advanced students. One wrong move, one finger in the wrong place, and the whole thing would collapse like a house of cards. But David didn't make mistakes. Or if he did, they were so small that they disappeared into the emotion of the performance. Because that was the thing that struck everyone in the room. It wasn't just that he could play the notes. Lots of students could play the notes if they practiced enough. It was the feeling behind every phrase, the way he seemed to be telling a story without words. When the music swelled, building toward a crescendo, David's whole body moved with it. His shoulders lifted, his back swayed. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was living inside the music, and somehow he was bringing everyone in the room along with him. Klaus felt something strange happening in his chest, a tightness that he couldn't quite explain. He had built his reputation on being tough, on maintaining the highest standards, on never letting sentimentality cloud his judgment. Emotions had no place in proper evaluation. Yet here he was, feeling his eyes sting as this American kid with a grocery bag full of sheet music played like someone who had known heartbreak and joy and loss and hope. The music shifted again, moving into a quieter section. David's touch on the keys became gentle, almost whisper-soft. Each note was placed carefully, like someone handling something precious that might break. This was the part that had given him the most trouble during practice. The slow sections were harder than the fast ones because there was nowhere to hide. Every note was exposed, naked, raw. Mrs. Eleanor had worked with him on this part for weeks. "Listen to the silence between the notes," she had told him, her arthritic hands resting on his shoulders. The music isn't just in the sound, it's in the space around the sound. He could almost feel her presence now, standing beside him the way she used to during their lessons in her small living room. The room that smelled like lavender and old books. The room where a broken-down upright piano became the center of his universe. Outside the audition room, something unusual was happening. A few students had been walking past when they heard the music. One of them stopped. Then another. Then a teacher who was heading to her next class paused in the hallway. Music leaked out from under the door and through the old walls like water finding cracks. People who knew classical music recognized the piece immediately. Rachmaninoff, the third concerto, the one that even professional pianists sometimes avoided because it was just too demanding. And whoever was playing it in there was making it sound effortless. A small crowd began to form in the hallway. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, listening, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. A janitor pushing a cleaning cart stopped and leaned on his mop. Two girls who had been chatting about their upcoming recital fell silent. Inside the room, David moved into the final section of the excerpt he had prepared. This was it, the part where everything came together. The melody built and built, climbing, higher, the notes coming faster, his hands crossing over each other again and again in patterns that looked impossible. Sweat formed on his forehead. His arms were beginning to ache. But he pushed through it because this was the moment that mattered. This was what he had come here for. Not just to play the notes correctly, but to show these people what music meant to him, what it had meant to Mrs. Eleanor, what it could mean to anyone who really listened. The sound filled every corner of the room. It bounced off the walls and the ceiling. It wrapped around the judges and the expensive furniture and the degrees hanging on the walls. For those few minutes, nothing else existed except the music and the boy creating it. Klaus realized he was gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles had turned white. He couldn't remember the last time he had reacted physically to a performance like this. Maybe never. Thomas had given up any pretense of taking notes. He was just listening now, his mouth slightly open. Professor Steinberg had tears running down her cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away, and then, just when it seemed like the music couldn't possibly build any higher, David closed his eyes. His hands kept moving, but his eyes were shut, and he was playing entirely from memory and feeling. His body swayed like a tree in wind. His face showed every emotion the music carried: pain, joy, longing, hope. The final notes rang out clear and strong. David held them, letting them fade naturally into silence. His hand stayed on the keys for a moment longer, as if he wasn't quite ready to let go of what he had just created. Then he lifted his fingers. The last sound dissolved into the air. The room was completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of judgment, but the profound silence that comes after something sacred has happened. David slowly opened his eyes. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had done it. He had played the piece all the way through without any major mistakes. Whatever happened next, at least he had done that much. He took a breath and turned around to face the judges. What he saw shocked him completely. Klaus was standing. That was the first thing David noticed. The man who had looked so comfortable in his chair, so ready to dismiss him, was now standing beside the table. His hands were braced against the wood like he needed something to hold on to. But it was Klaus's face that really caught David's attention. The stern expression was gone. In its place was something David couldn't quite read. The man's eyes were red, glistening. Was he angry? No, that wasn't it. Klaus was crying, not sobbing or making any sound, but tears were definitely running down his face. He seemed almost embarrassed by them, quickly wiping his cheeks with the back of his hand. Professor Steinberg wasn't even trying to hide her emotions. She had pulled a tissue from her purse and was dabbing at her eyes, a soft smile on her face. Thomas just sat there staring at David like he was seeing a ghost. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. Finally, Klaus cleared his throat. His voice came out rough, like he was struggling to find the right words. "Who taught you to play like that?" It wasn't the question David had expected. He thought maybe Klaus would ask about his training schedule or his technical preparation. But instead, he wanted to know about feeling, about emotion. My teacher back home," David said quietly. "Mrs. Eleanor Wright. She played organ at the church for 40 years. "A church organist," Klaus repeated slowly. He walked around the table, moving closer to the piano, closer to David. "She taught you Rachmaninoff?" "Not exactly, sir. I mean, she showed me the basics when I was younger. How to read music, how to find the right posture. But the Rachmaninoff..." David paused, trying to find the right words. "I learned that mostly on my own, from videos online, from listening to recordings over and over." "Then what did she teach you?" Professor Steinberg asked gently. Her voice was kind, genuinely curious. David thought about those afternoons in Mrs. Eleanor's living room, the way sunlight would stream through her lace curtains, the smell of the tea she always made, the patience in her voice even when he messed up the same passage for the 20th time. "She taught me to listen," he said finally. "Not just to the music, but to what's behind it. She used to say that every piece of music is telling a story, and our job isn't just to play the notes. It's to understand the story and share it with people." Klaus had moved close enough now that David could see the details of his face, the lines around his eyes, the silver stubble on his jaw. Up close, he looked older than David had first thought. 60, maybe 65. "Tell me about her," Klaus said. It wasn't a request. It was something deeper than that. Almost a plea. David hadn't expected to talk about Mrs. Eleanor today. He had prepared himself to discuss his training, his technique, maybe his future goals. But not this. Not the memories that still hurt too much to touch. She was 78 when I met her," David began. His voice felt thick in his throat. "I was 12. My mom had bought this beat-up piano at a garage sale because I kept begging for one. It was missing 3 keys and totally out of tune, but I loved it. I taught myself some basic songs from YouTube videos." Thomas had started taking notes now, but not the clinical kind of notes he usually took during auditions. He was leaning forward, actually interested. "One summer evening, I had my window open while I was practicing. I lived in this small house right next to Mrs. Eleanor's place. She heard me playing and came over. I thought she was going to complain about the noise." David smiled at the memory. Instead, she asked if I wanted real lessons. Said she couldn't pay much attention to her own playing anymore because of her arthritis, but she could still teach. Did your family pay her? Professor Steinberg asked. She wouldn't take money. My mom tried, but Mrs. Eleanor refused. She said music wasn't something you charged for. It was something you shared. David's eyes were stinging now. He blinked hard. We did lessons 3 times a week for 7 years. In her living room, on her old upright that wasn't much better than mine. Klaus had sat down on the edge of the piano bench right next to where David was sitting. It was an oddly intimate gesture, nothing like the formal distance he had maintained before. What happened to her? Klaus asked quietly. David had known this question was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. She got sick last year. Cancer. She fought it for 8 months, but he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of shared grief, of understanding. Before she died, David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She made me promise something. She had some money saved up. Not much, but enough. She wanted me to use it to audition somewhere big, somewhere that could give me real opportunities. She said I had something special and it would be a waste to keep it hidden in our small town. So you came here, Professor Steinberg said softly. I came here. The plane ticket took most of the money. I've been sleeping at the airport for 3 days because I couldn't afford a hotel. My flight back home leaves tonight. David looked at his hands, still resting on the piano keys. I promised her I would try. That's all, just try. She didn't care if I got in or not. She just wanted me to know that I was good enough to walk through these doors and play. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer. My mother was a piano teacher. Nothing famous. She taught children in our apartment in Berlin. Basic lessons for beginners mostly. But she loved it. She loved watching young people discover music for the first time. David looked at him, surprised. Klaus had seemed so harsh, so professional. It was strange to think of him as someone's son. Someone who had learned piano from his mother. She died when I was 30, Klaus continued. I had just been hired here at the conservatory. I thought I was too busy to visit her as much as I should have. Too focused on my career, on building my reputation. He wiped his face again. I never got to play for her one last time. Never got to show her how far I had come. The confession hung in the air between them. David didn't know what to say. What could anyone say to that kind of regret? When you played just now, Klaus said, looking directly at David for the first time with something other than judgment in his eyes. I heard my mother, not her playing, but her teaching. The way she talked about music as something alive, something that connects us to each other and to the people we've lost. Thomas was no longer taking notes. He was just listening, his professional mask completely gone. Klaus stood up and walked back to the table. He picked up David's application folder and stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at his colleagues. We need to talk, he said to them, privately, for just a moment. Professor Steinberg and Thomas both nodded. They understood this was something bigger than a normal audition decision. Klaus turned back to David. Would you mind waiting outside? Just for a few minutes, David stood up, his legs feeling shaky. Of course, sir. As he walked toward the door, still clutching his grocery bag, Professor Steinberg called out to him. David? He turned around. That was the most beautiful audition I've heard in 23 years of teaching here. No matter what happens next, you should know that. David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. And that's when he saw them. At least 20 people crowded in the corridor. Students, teachers, even the janitor with his mop. They had all been listening through the door. When David appeared, they started clapping. It wasn't polite audition applause. It was real. Some people were smiling. Others had tears on their faces. A girl about his age mouthed the words, "That was amazing," at him. David stood there, overwhelmed, as the applause continued. He had come here expecting to fail. Expected to prove Klaus right, that he would embarrass himself in seconds. Instead, something completely different had happened. He had played for Mrs. Eleanor one last time. And somehow, across an ocean and beyond death itself, she had been right there with him. Behind the closed door, 3 judges were having the most important conversation of David's life. And he had no idea what they were saying. David stood in the hallway, surrounded by strangers who had become an unexpected audience. The applause had faded, but people were still lingering. A few students whispered to each other in German. Others just smiled at him as they finally headed to their own classes and rehearsals. An older man with white hair and a violin case approached him. He spoke in heavily accented English. "I have taught here 31 years. That is the first time I stopped my class to listen at a door. Beautiful, just beautiful." Before David could respond, the man patted his shoulder and walked away, leaving David even more confused about what was happening. The applause, the compliments, the tears, it all felt surreal, like he had stepped into someone else's life. But behind that closed door, his real life was being decided. Inside the audition room, Klaus stood with his back to his colleagues. Staring out the tall window at the Vienna street below, students walked past carrying instrument cases. A bus rolled by. Normal life continuing like nothing important was happening. "We cannot accept him," Klaus said quietly. "You both know this." Professor Steinberg's expression hardened. "Klaus, you cannot be serious. After what we just heard?" "After what we just heard," Klaus turned around. "We all need to remember what this institution stands for. Standards, requirements, structure." He picked up David's application and read from it. No formal training from any recognized academy. No documented study with an accredited instructor. No performance history beyond a county fair. He does not meet a single one of our entrance criteria. Thomas adjusted his glasses, looking uncomfortable. The rules exist for a reason. We receive thousands of applications. If we make an exception for him, what message does that send? It sends the message that we care about talent, Professor Steinberg shot back. That we care about musicality and feeling and all the things we claim to value when we talk about art. Klaus sat down heavily in his chair. He suddenly looked very tired. "Do you think I want to reject him? Do you think I enjoyed watching that performance and knowing what I have to do now? Then don't do it," Professor Steinberg said simply. "We have the authority to make exceptions. That authority exists precisely for situations like this." Situations like what? A talented student with no credentials? No. Situations where we encounter someone genuinely extraordinary. She leaned forward, her voice passionate. "Klaus, I have been here for over 2 decades. I have heard students who went on to play at La Scala and the Royal Albert Hall. That boy out there has something most of them never had. He has a voice. A real artistic voice that speaks directly to the soul." Klaus rubbed his temples. "And what happens after we admit him? He is years behind our other students in formal training. Music theory, composition, history of classical performance. He knows nothing about any of this." "He can learn those things," Thomas said quietly. Both Klaus and Professor Steinberg looked at him in surprise. He had been the most skeptical at the beginning. "I am just saying, technique can be taught, musicianship can be developed. But what he has? That cannot be taught. You either have it or you don't." Klaus stood up and began pacing. "If we admit him, the board will ask questions. Other faculty members will object. Students who were rejected will demand to know why their applications were not given the same consideration." "Let them ask," Professor Steinberg said firmly. "We tell them the truth. We heard something exceptional and we responded to it. That is what this conservatory was founded to do, to recognize and nurture genuine artistry." "It sets a precedent," Klaus argued. "Good. Maybe it is time we set a new precedent. Maybe we have become too focused on papers and credentials and forgotten what music actually is." The room fell silent. Klaus continued pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the decision was visible on his face. This was not just about one student. It was about what he believed, what he stood for, what kind of educator he wanted to be. Finally, he stopped pacing and looked at his colleagues. "If we do this, we do it properly. Full scholarship, yes, but also intensive supplementary training to bring him up to speed on everything he has missed, private tutoring in music theory and history. Additional hours with faculty to develop his technical foundations." Professor Steinberg smiled. "You are going to accept him?" "I am saying it is possible, but he will have to work harder than any student who has ever walked through these doors. The scholarship will cover tuition, but what about housing? Food? He is sleeping in an airport, for God's sake." "The conservatory has work-study positions," Thomas suggested. "Library assistant, concert hall maintenance. He could earn enough to cover basic expenses." Klaus walked back to the window, his reflection visible in the glass. "My mother used to tell me that our job as teachers is not to create perfect musicians. It is to help students become who they are meant to be." He turned back to face them. "I think I forgot that somewhere along the way. I became so concerned with maintaining standards that I stopped seeing the students as people with their own stories. So we are in agreement? Professor Steinberg asked. Klaus looked down at David's application one more time. A grocery bag full of sheet music. 3 days sleeping in an airport. A promise to a dying woman. Sometimes the most important things could not be measured by standard criteria. We are in agreement, Klaus said finally. But I want to be clear with him about what this means. The challenges he will face. The work required. He needs to understand that this will not be easy. Thomas nodded. Should we call him back in? Klaus straightened his suit jacket and took a deep breath. Yes, let's tell him. Outside in the hallway, David had found a bench where he sat clutching his grocery bag. The crowd had dispersed. He was alone now with his thoughts and his racing heart. He kept replaying the audition in his mind, analyzing every note, every phrase, wondering if he had done enough. Probably not, he decided. Klaus had been right from the beginning. What was he thinking coming here? A church organist and some YouTube videos did not prepare someone for a place like this. He checked his phone. His flight was in 6 hours. He would need to leave for the airport soon. At least he could tell his mom he tried. At least he could keep that promise to Mrs. Eleanor. The door opened. Professor Steinberg stepped out, her expression unreadable. David, we are ready for you now. His legs felt heavy as he stood up. This was it. The rejection. The polite explanation of why he did not meet their standards. He had heard it before from other schools. They always said things like, impressive for your level or continue developing your skills. Nice words that meant no. He walked back into the room. Klaus was standing beside the piano again, his posture formal. Thomas had his hands folded on the table. They all looked so serious. David prepared himself to hear the word he had been expecting all along, but Klaus did not say no. Instead, he said something David never imagined possible. Something that would change everything. David, we have made our decision, Klaus began, his voice steady but not unkind. What you showed us today was extraordinary. Genuinely extraordinary, and that puts us in an unusual position. David held his breath. This conservatory has rules, standards that every applicant must meet. You do not meet those standards on paper. Your training is unconventional. Your credentials are not what we typically require. Klaus paused. But music is not about paper. It is not about credentials. It is about truth. And what you played today was truthful in a way that matters more than any document. Was this still a rejection? David could not tell. Klaus walked closer. We want to offer you a full scholarship to study here. All tuition covered. But I need you to understand what you would be accepting. You are years behind our other students in formal training. You will need to work harder than you have ever worked in your life. There will be supplementary classes, additional tutoring, long hours catching up on theory and history. David's mind was spinning. Had Klaus just said scholarship? Furthermore, Klaus continued, we will arrange a work-study position for you in our library. It will not pay much, but enough to cover housing and basic expenses. You will not be sleeping in airports anymore. Professor Steinberg was smiling now. Thomas looked relieved. David tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. Are you saying I'm accepted? I am saying, Klaus replied, and for the first time there was genuine warmth in his expression, that you have been given an opportunity. What you do with it is up to you. David felt his knees go weak. This was not real. This could not be real. I know this is overwhelming, Professor Steinberg said gently. You do not have to answer right away. Take some time to think about it. But David was already shaking his head. I don't need time. Yes, I accept. Thank you. Thank you so much. The words felt inadequate for what he was feeling. Joy, disbelief, gratitude, fear, everything hitting him at once. Klaus extended his hand. Welcome to the Royal Conservatory of Music, David. As David shook his hand, he thought about Mrs. Eleanor, about her small living room and terrible tea and endless patience, about the promise he had made to her. He had tried, and somehow impossibly he had succeeded. 5 years later, the same audition room looked different to David, or maybe he was the one who had changed. He stood outside the door again, but this time he wore a properly fitted suit instead of thrift store clothes. His shoes were polished. His sheet music was in a leather portfolio, not a grocery bag, but his hands were shaking just like they had that first day. Tonight was his senior recital, the final performance that would mark the end of his time at the conservatory. In classical music tradition, graduating students performed a full solo concert showcasing everything they had learned. It was both a celebration and a test. Family, faculty, and students would all be there. David had chosen to play the same piece he had played at his audition. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. It felt right somehow. A way to close the circle. The past 5 years had been the hardest of his life. Klaus had not been exaggerating when he said David would have to work harder than anyone else. Those first few months he had felt completely lost. Music theory classes where everyone else seemed to speak a language he barely understood. History lectures about composers and periods he had never studied. Technique sessions where instructors pointed out flaws in his hand position that Mrs. Eleanor had never mentioned. There were nights he had called his mom, crying, saying he wanted to come home. That he did not belong here. That Klaus had made a mistake accepting him. But his mom always said the same thing. Mrs. Eleanor believed in you. That man Klaus believes in you. Now you need to believe in yourself. So he had kept going. 18-hour days of classes, practice, study, and his library job. While other students went out on weekends, David was in practice rooms. While they slept, he was reading textbooks about music theory. His fingers developed calluses on top of calluses. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but slowly something changed. The theory started making sense. The history began connecting to the music he played. His technique improved, became more refined. He was still behind many of his classmates, but the gap was closing, and through it all, Klaus was there. The stern director who had almost dismissed him became something like a father figure. Klaus gave him extra lessons, stayed late to work on difficult passages, pushed him when he wanted to quit, and encouraged him when he felt hopeless. "You have something most of my students will never have," Klaus told him once, during a particularly difficult practice session. "You know why you play. Most of them play because their parents wanted it, or because they are good at it. But you play because music saved you. Because it connected you to someone you loved. That matters more than perfect technique." Now standing outside the concert hall on the night of his recital, David felt the weight of those 5 years. Every struggle, every small victory, every moment of doubt, it all led to this. Professor Steinberg appeared beside him, elegant in a dark blue dress. "Nervous?" "Terrified," David admitted. She smiled. "Good. The day you stop being nervous before a performance is the day you stop caring. Is your mother here?" "Front row. She flew in yesterday. First time she's ever been to Europe." David's voice caught slightly. "I wish Mrs. Eleanor could be here too." "She is," Professor Steinberg said gently, touching his shoulder. "In every note you play, she is here." Through the door, David could hear the murmur of the crowd taking their seats. The concert hall held 300 people, and he knew it would be full tonight. His classmates, his teachers, music lovers from around Vienna, who came to the conservatory's student performances. And Klaus. Always Klaus, who would be sitting in his usual seat in the front row, just off to the left. The stage manager appeared. 5 minutes, David." This was it. David walked into the backstage area. The grand piano sat on the stage, illuminated by spotlights. Beyond it, he could see rows of seats filling with people. He spotted his mom, looking nervous and proud at the same time. She gave him a small wave. Next to her sat Klaus. Even from backstage, David could see the director's familiar profile. The man who had changed his life with a single decision to look past the rules and see the person underneath. The lights in the hall dimmed. The crowd quieted. The stage manager nodded at David. He walked out onto the stage. The applause was warm, welcoming. These people had watched him grow over 5 years. They had heard him in student recitals, in practice rooms, in informal performances. They knew his story. The American kid who had shown up with nothing but raw talent and a promise to a dead woman. David sat at the piano bench, adjusted the height, the familiar ritual that always calmed his nerves slightly. He placed his hands over the keys and took a deep breath. Then he began to play. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff rolled out into the hall, and suddenly David was 12 years old again, sitting at that broken garage sale piano in his mother's small house. He was in Mrs. Eleanor's living room, watching her arthritic hands demonstrate a passage she could no longer play herself, but could still hear perfectly in her mind. He was 19. terrified, walking into an audition room where a man told him he would fail in seconds. And he was here, now, 24 years old, playing the same piece but understanding it in ways he could not have imagined back then. The technical passages that had seemed impossible were now just part of the landscape. The emotional depth that he had grasped intuitively before was now supported by years of study and understanding. But the core of it, the reason he played, the truth behind the notes, that had not changed. That came from Mrs. Eleanor. From those afternoons learning that music was not about perfection, it was about connection, about sharing something human and vulnerable and real. As he played, David's mind was both focused on the music and wandering through memories. The first time Klaus had told him well done after a practice session, the night he had finally understood a complex theory concept and actually cried from relief. The moment he realized he belonged here, that he had earned his place through work and dedication, the audience disappeared. The concert hall disappeared. There was only the piano and the music and the feeling. In the front row, Klaus sat very still. His eyes were wet just like they had been 5 years ago, but this time tears were not from surprise. They were from pride, from watching a student not just learn but transform, from knowing that he had made the right choice that day, even though it had broken every rule he had lived by. Next to him, David's mother clutched a tissue, crying openly. Her boy, who had fallen in love with a broken piano from a garage sale, who had practiced until his fingers bled, who had found a mentor in an elderly church organist, who had taken a chance on a dream that seemed impossible. He was here. He had made it. The music built toward the climax, David's hands flying across the keys with the confidence of someone who had played this piece 1,000 times, but was still discovering new things in it. The technical brilliance was there, yes, but more importantly, the soul was there. The honesty, the vulnerability. As he approached the final section, David opened his eyes for a moment and caught Klaus's gaze. The director nodded slightly, a tiny gesture that said everything. I am proud of you. You have exceeded every expectation. You belong here. David closed his eyes again and poured everything into the final measures. All the gratitude, all the love, all the memory of Mrs. Eleanor and her belief in him, all the work of the past 5 years, all the fear and doubt and triumph. The last notes rang out clear and powerful. David held them, letting them fade naturally into silence. His hands stayed on the keys for a moment, just like they had 5 years ago. Then he lifted his fingers. The sound dissolved. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the concert hall erupted. People stood applauding. His mother was openly sobbing. Professor Steinberg was on her feet, clapping with tears streaming down her face. Students were whistling and cheering, and Klaus stood slowly, his hands coming together in steady, deliberate applause. His face showed everything he usually kept hidden: pride, joy, gratitude for having witnessed something rare. David stood and bowed. Then he did something he had not planned. He looked directly at Klaus and placed his hand over his heart. A simple gesture that meant thank you for taking a chance, for believing, for pushing him to be better than he thought possible. Klaus nodded again, understanding completely. As the applause continued, David looked up toward the ceiling of the concert hall, as if he could see through it to whatever lay beyond. He imagined Mrs. Eleanor there, smiling that gentle smile she always had when he played well. He imagined her saying what she always used to say after a good practice session. See, I told you that you could do it. The boy who was told he would fail in seconds had just finished a performance that no one in that concert hall would ever forget. Not because it was technically perfect, though it was remarkable, but because it was true. And in the end, truth was what mattered most. Klaus had learned that lesson 5 years ago from a terrified kid with a grocery bag. And tonight, in this concert hall, that lesson was proven right once again. Music was not about credentials or rules or meeting standards on paper. It was about the human heart finding a way to speak when words were not enough. David had found his voice, and he had used it to honor everyone who had believed in him when belief seemed foolish. The applause continued, and somewhere in the space between the notes and the silence, Mrs. Eleanor was listening.